So what have you been working on?
I am working with male teenagers' diaries from the 1930s Soviet Russia.
Okay, so I know not very much about Soviet Russia. I know that Stalin was a dictator, and I know a little bit about the siege of Leningrad because I have a colleague who is working on that in smell studies. But besides that, not that much. So how have you brought Diaries and Stalin-era Russia together?
So I explore how teenage boys use diary keeping to navigate growing up, both conforming to Stalinist social and cultural norms and carving out a safe space for their individuation. And I found that for those diarists, writing practices, starting from simple everyday journaling to very sophisticated literary experiments, served not only as a means of self-expression or processing their experiences, but as a specific mode of being, or rather becoming, Soviet.
So I'm a literary person and I work a little bit with diaries, mostly, well, entirely, in fact, writers in English, essentially, but certainly no teenagers. So why did you decide to focus on teenage diaries?
Well, partly precisely because of what you just said, that people focus on the diaries of famous people and they look into those diaries hoping to find something that will shed light onto their literary work or their lives, also kind of connected to our understanding of their literary work. And I am more interested in diaries as a habit or as a practice, as a kind of a lived experience, how you open your notebook every day and you put words down, and what does it do for you, and specifically what did it do for those young people who found themselves in a very specific, unique position. They were essentially the first Soviet generation. They were born in the early 1920s, so they didn't have any pre-revolutionary experience. Everything they knew was the Soviet reality around them. And they had to navigate it somehow. They had to figure out how to become adults in this very demanding and also very controversial, very high pressure social and cultural environment. And diaries proved to be an essential tool to do so.
So what kind of methodology did you employ when you came to look at these diaries? Was it kind of archival work or something else?
Well, those diaries, some of them are published, and some of them are kind of published by, well, like amateurs, so they are relatives, or some ended up in local newspapers or magazines, and some are still in the archives. And I am very blessed that I don't actually need to go to physical archives that much, and now I can't because I can't go back to Russia. But there is a wonderful digital crowdsourced archive with a large collection of Russian language diaries. They also have a smaller bulk of Ukrainian and Belarusian language diaries. And it's an indispensable source of archival materials for researchers like myself. And this is where I found the majority of my protagonists.
So I imagine that some of these people that you were reading about might have descendants. Do you happen to have any experience kind of speaking to their family members or anything like that?
Yes, actually I've liaised with a couple of descendants of those diarists that I work with, and one particular story is very interesting because I suddenly, at some point working on those diaries, I realized that I actually already know one of the descendants, that I am acquainted with the daughter of one of the diarists, because she is a literary scholar, and I did my BA in philology, and this is how I came to know her. At a conference maybe, I don't remember, but we are friends on Facebook. And I suddenly realized that this is the daughter of that man, and I was fascinated by the connections, and I just wrote to her and said, I'm working on those diaries, including the diary of your father. Can you tell me more about him? Can you show me photos? And she did, and it was a wonderful experience.
Wow, what an insane coincidence.
Yeah.
So I'm really interested in hearing more about the contents of these diaries. What kind of things were they writing about?
Well, many different things. It depends on the diarist, but what I find important to do in my work is to pay attention to those diaries that we might consider uninteresting or boring. Actually, one of my chapters in the dissertation is called Boring Diaries, because you expect people who lived through the 1930s, through Stalin's dictatorship, you expect them to write about something fascinating or terrifying or both. And a lot of the times when you read through those diaries of 13, 14, 15-year-old teenagers, you find nothing like that. They just write about school, homework, family affairs, hobbies, friends, their first romantic interests. They're very worried about getting good grades and things like that. They have reading lists of the books they read, and so on. And those diaries, or diaries like that, tend to be dismissed or discarded. Like, there's nothing interesting. It's just typical adolescent concerns. Mm-hmm. And I've seen this phrase used in research, in scholarly work, where people want to segue into something more interesting. Because there are some teenage diaries that talk about contemporary politics, or their authors voice their political dissent, and this is what seems to be drawing the most attention. But I focus on those who just kind of lived their lives, and I am trying to unpack what it actually meant, because typical adolescent concerns are not in fact typical. They're not ahistorical, they're very historically conditioned. So how exactly were those teenagers concerned with all those things that I just mentioned, and why? And what language they used to talk about it, and what regular writing did for them, why it was important for them to log in every day and write, oh, I went to school today and I got such and such grades and I read such and such book. And then you start thinking about it, you see how deeply embedded in the Stalinist ideological and cultural reality they actually were. So I'm trying to give them more credit than they were given before, because they deserve it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think that teenagers ought to be listened to. It's one of those, I mean, you hear that word impressionable being used all the time when we talk about teenagers. And it's true, they're like sponges, when we're younger, we're sponges and we absorb all of this stuff. And it sounds like a lot of the things that you were talking about were actually quite relatable maybe to a modern day teenager talking about school and family and friends. Are there ways in which these diaries would be relatable to someone in contemporary society, or do you think that they're kind of very embedded in their context?
Well, I think both. There is no contradiction between those two things. So of course we can't just assume that teenagers are always going to be teenagers or something, and that we can just assume that they had the same experiences. But at the same time, we can definitely relate to the struggles they had if we look at them on a more like kind of structural level. So what I'm talking about is that those teenagers who came of age in the late 1930s, they experienced immense societal pressure to grow up successfully, to turn into accomplished, fully fledged Soviet adults. And there was this contradictory idea that on the one hand, you had to serve the collective, you had to work for the good of the people, and to build this socialist utopia that was about to come. But on the other hand, to do so, to be of use to the collective, you had to be exceptional. When you grew up, you saw all those Stalinist heroes, pilots, polar explorers, shock workers, and you thought that you had to be like them in order to be useful. And if you were average, mediocre, then you would be just cast aside and left on the sidewalk of history, and the world would move on without you. So surprisingly, this was in a very peculiar, twisted way, a very individualistic culture, or kind of individual-centered, because you were fully responsible for your self-development and for your success as a Soviet person. So there was a lot of emphasis put on self-improvement and self-perfection, and you could never stop. So that was a lot of psychological pressure that they lived under, and I think this is something that we can relate to under very different circumstances. But as I'm speaking, I'm sure you can recognize, maybe even yourself, or like I surely sometimes recognize myself, thinking that I have to excel, that I have to perform. And in this regard, their diary became their safe space, where they could, on the one hand, practice this self-development and try different self-disciplining tools to become better, but without being sanctioned or censored or controlled by other people. So they could try it out for themselves, and on the other hand, they could just hide away from it, and they could find their sense of self-worth and affirm their sense of self, that they were actually good enough at being Soviet people. So yeah, in short, I think both. It's very specific to this Stalinist culture, but on the other hand, we can totally sympathize with them.
Yeah, and when you're a teenager, you're becoming the person that you're going to be. There's this kind of intense, fraught stage where you feel a lot of pressure to be an adult, but you're not yet an adult. And yeah, it's interesting. I wonder whether you work on male teenage diaries, right? So I wonder have you encountered any female teenage diaries? Was it something that male teenagers typically did? And why did you choose to work on them?
Well, there are several reasons for that. First, is just so happened that I focused on male diarists, because I started working on this topic when I was doing my master's in history, and I just wrote an essay on those teenage diarists who wanted to become writers, and they all happened to be male. And it sparked my interest, and I thought maybe there is something more in there, and I decided to focus only on boys, because if I had chosen to focus on both, it would have been a totally different dissertation because you have to factor in those gender issues. So I just decided to leave girls aside for the time being. But there are other reasons for that. Actually, I think in diary studies and literary studies, it is believed that diary keeping is more of a female pursuit, that it is a form of private writing where women could exercise their creativity, where they didn't have enough access to actual literary work. And it doesn't seem to be the case for the 1930s Soviet Russia. So of course, it's a fallacy of source selection because we only have those diaries that survived and that we were able to find in the archives, and that I personally was able to find and read. But still, it seems that there are no fewer male diaries than there are female, and a lot of those male diaries are focused on practicing writing as a professional skill. So actually, going back to this first essay that I wrote, a lot of those teenagers wanted to become writers. And in the Soviet Union at that time, writing was positioned as, well, maybe not explicitly, but implicitly it was so that it was an exclusively male pursuit. Because all the top Soviet writers, the most hailed ones, were male. Gorky, Nikolai Ostrovsky, Fadeev, all men. And if you look at the school curriculum in the late 1930s, there was not a single female writer there. So all the books, all the texts that you studied as a school student were written by men. So of course, implicitly you had this idea that writing is for boys. And given that writers were praised not only as kind of high-skilled professionals, but also as, if we use this famous quote from Stalin, the engineers of human souls. So they had this specific status within the very literature-centered, literature-oriented Stalinist culture. So becoming a writer was a way to become a Stalinist hero without actually becoming a traditional sort of hero, not a pilot, not a polar explorer, not a soldier. Because to be fair, to become a pilot or a polar explorer required a lot of training and a lot of privilege to have access to this kind of career. So writing seemed more attainable. And at the same time, it provided those teenagers with a legitimate outlet for their self-expression. So you could write showing your creativity and pouring your individuality, to a certain extent, but still you could become known, you could become famous, and you can become praised for who you were, for your unique talent. And that was very appealing if we go back to what I said earlier, that you had to excel, and you didn't feel like you could excel in other more demanding professions. So that's why a lot of male teenagers ventured into writing, into trying themselves in prose and poetry. Overall, I think that there is this connection between how they experience their masculinity and this writing pursuit. Because it's interesting that you asked about female diarists, right? So there are quite a few of them, and if we read through their diaries, we see that a lot of the times they are quite concerned with their femininity and the question of how to be a woman and what it meant to be a specifically Soviet woman. because the expectations were quite contradictory. I won't go into this now, maybe later if if we want to entertain this topic, but it was not that easy to balance all the expectations imposed on Soviet women. And it was a little bit easier to be a Soviet man because Stalinist culture was inherently masculine or masculinized. And a lot of role models, as I just said, were masculine, and a lot of values and a lot of qualities that were praised, resilience, enthusiasm, strength, were seen as masculine. So when those boys were thinking about their future and their profession, they weren't thinking about how to become Soviet men specifically. They were thinking about how to become Soviet adults, Soviet men as in people. They weren't actually preoccupied that much with the gender side of things, but it doesn't mean that gender is not a part of this equation, right? So I'm also trying to uncover those kind of implicitly masculine patterns and behaviors that they engaged with without actually thinking that they were specifically masculine.
I recognize something of myself, I think, in what you've said. I'm someone who has kept a diary since I was a teenager, and still do to this day. But if I think back to my, 12-year-old self writing a diary, I often think about how kind of conservative I was with my feelings. I don't think I was revealing the kind of deepest, darkest depths of my soul. I was almost writing for an audience, as though someone might one day read my 12-year-old diary, which I really hope they don't. And I feel that way about my diary today. But is there a similar sense that these, I think you maybe already answered this question for me, but is there a similar sense that these teenagers felt that they were writing for a purpose rather than just to get their thoughts and feelings down on paper?
Yes. So again, it depends on the diarists, and some reflected on the purpose of keeping a diary and some didn't. But I think there are kind of different levels to this question. So on the one hand, most people don't like to have their diary read by other people, their parents or their classmates or whoever. They want to keep their writing private. But it doesn't mean that they are only writing for themselves, because the structure of writing about yourself, the split between the I that is writing and the I that is being written about, is always there. And you still have this image of the audience inside your head. Some scholars call it the expert group. So people, like imaginary people, and sometimes real ones as well, who represent the values and behaviors and rules that you deem important. So you kind of writing for them, even if you don't plan on actual real people reading what you wrote. So of course they had this imaginary audience in mind. And some of them specifically had their future selves in mind when they were writing, because as I mentioned before, a lot of them used diary writing as a tool for self-discipline. Imagining this better version of yourself kind of help you stay on track and make those regular entries so that you could look back and see how you've grown. But also, speaking about cultural specifics, a lot of those diarists interested in professionalizing as writers imagined their diaries as not just accounts of their thoughts and feelings, but they wanted to turn them into this sort of proto-literature or pre-literature, so this preparatory text about life around them, their social circle, and the things that they heard about the larger world, so that when they grow up, this diary could either become source material for their future work, a novel. Who didn't dream of writing a novel when they were a teenager? Or just becoming a document in itself. So they thought, if I become famous, this diary will be an invaluable document about my life and the life of people around me. And for some of them, it actually became the case. For example, I work with the diary of a boy who later became a quite famous Soviet poet, David Samoilov. So his diary is, in a way, a window into his life and a source material for his biographers and people who study his poetry. But this idea was rooted in their cultural sensibilities and their understanding of what good literature is, and specifically in socialist realism, this style of writing, or this paradigm in which all Soviet writers had to work, starting from the mid-1930s. One of the idea underlining socialist realism is that your writing had to be true to life. And that meant not only that it was realistic, or that you wrote what you saw, right, and that you just documented life around you, but that you had enough of a scope and enough of an understanding so that you could present the reality around you as coherent and historically accurate, we might say. So actually it wasn't just about writing about yourself, but about the world around you, so that you could be true in this very specific sense. So this is something that I also look into, how socialist realism and those ideas about what literature is that developed in Stalinist culture, how they influenced this non-literary writing, or like para-literary writing that those teenagers engaged in.
So if they're writing about their reality, I wonder whether there was an element of risk involved in writing diaries. You know, if you had maybe dissenting views, or, you know, being a teenager is a time when you're trying to work out things about yourself, what you feel about the world, where your politics lie. Was there a sense that they were maybe aware of that risk in writing about those things?
Well, some of them were, but again, someone who approaches those diaries thinking about Stalinism as this time of kind of total fear and terror and repression, which in a way it was. But if that's your only understanding of the Stalinist times, then you'd be surprised how open and how naive those diaries often are. And even those who wrote about their dissenting views, they seem to be staggeringly sincere in our today's understanding. But not a lot of them actually had any dissenting views. So a lot of them were following the party line and just regurgitating what they read in the newspapers. But yeah, some of them actually, among my diarists, almost no one can be called kind of well, not a dissident, because this term didn't exist, and this kind of social position didn't exist in the 1930s, but they couldn't be called politically descendant.
Dissenting?
dissenting, yeah. But I'm thinking about a famous female diary, and it's actually translated into English. It's the diary of Nina Lugovskaya. She was a daughter of a quite high-ranking party member who was repressed, and she was repressed alongside him and other members of their family, and her diary were actually made known to the public because it was found in her NKVD file. So yes, sometimes it was indeed risky and it was used as evidence, obviously, against her and her father. So sometimes it was risky, but for a lot of those teenagers, it wasn't just because no one knew they kept diaries and no one actually cared. And they didn't care about this side of their life. And a lot of them grew to be quite conforming adults. And again, I think it is interesting to study them because they were in many regards average or uninteresting or just kind of everyman. But in other respects they weren't, and that's what I'm drawn to in this research.
I imagine that these teenagers were discovering certain things about themselves and perhaps falling in love for the first time. Did you find any instances where they were writing about romance or anything?
Oh yes, absolutely. They wrote a lot about girls. Unfortunately, I don't have any queer diarists, or at least they didn't voice their kind of queer sensibilities.
Maybe understandable, given the circumstances.
But yeah, they wrote a lot about girls and expecting love and longing for love and searching for love. And it's really interesting because they didn't have enough language to talk about romance, as the language of Stalinist culture available to them wasn't particularly romance focused. And the youth culture and youth propaganda was very reserved and rigid and purist, and you had to become good friends first before you fell in love, and you had to fall in love with the right person who was a good student, a good comrade, who was ideologically reliable. And so we see this in their diaries. They judge those girls whether they were kind of good comrades, or whether they had good enough grades, or whether they did enough communal work. Like, was she a good Komsomol member? And if she wasn't, well, and then also the thing that the girls were advised against doing was excessive flirting, and kind of showing that you are actually interested in love or relationships with kind of more than one person. And even with this one person, you were advised against flirting with, you had to establish a friendship with first. So if they saw girls that flirted with multiple boys, they would frown upon that. Actually, one thing that is true about almost all of those diaries, they were extremely judgmental. And actually culture kind of prompted them to be judgmental, but in those situations with girls it's kind of especially telling. But on the other hand, they still wanted to express their fascination and their interest and their the sexual tension between them, and without appropriate language within kind of available contemporary patterns, they turned to literature. Specifically to Romanticist literature of the early 19th century that they would read at school. They would read Pushkin, Lermontov, things like that, and they would imagine those girls as heroines of those poems and novels, you could find a very weird contradictory description of the same girl on one page. The male diarist would go, oh, she doesn't have good grades, so she's not very diligent, she's not very industrious, that's bad. I don't like it, she has to do better. And on the next page, he would compare her to Tatiana from Pushkin's Yevgeny Onegin, and he would talk about her deep eyes and her rosy cheeks and you know, all those poetic things that you would say to describe a woman's body. And that's a bit jarring from today's perspective, but they kind of tried to assemble their own language to talk about romance and to talk about the opposite sex, and yeah, this is what they had to deal with.
It's always interesting working with diaries, because sometimes if you know someone's work, for instance, say you know someone became a famous poet and you're familiar with their work, and you kind of go into the diary expecting to find something there based on the work. For example, I once looked at the diaries of Beatrix Potter, which have now gone out of print, and for good reason, because they're extremely dull. And she is the most whimsical writer ever. You know, she writes these wonderful children's stories about animals, and her diaries are just so like lethally boring. And I wonder, in English literature, when we approach a diary, we're often doing it so that we can make sense of another text. And I wonder whether there's something to be gained from a more historical approach, where you're taking these diaries on their own terms and learning from them. What do you think?
Yes, and this is what I'm trying to do, and I'm trying to preach with, oops, a spider. Trying to preach working on those boring diaries specifically. So not all the diaries I work with are boring. Some of them are like really captivating and dramatic. But some of them are literally just, oh, today I went to school and did this and did that. And I think what is important here is to look not at the content, which is, yes, dull to read, but again, it was not written for us to read. So, but to look at the writing practice itself. So why did this person think it was necessary, important, or beneficial for them to write this type of diary? And actually, I find research into English diaries very helpful in this regard, but not the diaries of writers or artists, but diaries of early English Protestants. The research into early modern diaries of the 16th and early 17th centuries. Because a lot of those diaries, like the diary of Samuel Pepys, for example, or Lady Margaret Hobby, or other English-speaking Protestants in Britain and in America, are again extremely dull to read. They just recount their days and so to bed, right? And there is hardly anything that we can gain some entertainment from. But this is not why those people kept those diaries. They kept account of things that they did and the blessings they received, and they searched for the signs of God's grace in their days, contemplating their life and their path to salvation. So for them, it was really important to document every single thing that happened to them, so that they could prove that they were good Christians, and that they could find proof in the accounts of their lives that they were about to be saved. If we're talking about this kind of radical Protestant Calvinist doctrine specifically, where you have this predestined salvation, so you were eager to figure out whether you were saved or not, but you had to have a comprehensive overview of your life to do so. Another thing, another insight into those diaries that I find helpful is that, again, it was embedded in the Protestant doctrine, but also in kind of early capitalist rationale and early forms of accounting, where you had to, well, account for every transaction, and it made those diarists approach writing as transactional and as this balance sheet of time well spent and time wasted. In general, this industrializing culture prompted people to be more acutely aware of the passage of time and how they spent it. And a lot of those things are surprisingly also true for Stalinist culture. It was very focused on this industrial time, this linear time propelling forward, and very focused on efficiency and working for the greater good. Well, it wasn't your salvation, it was building of the communist utopia, but still. In this regard, the type of writing that those two cultures encouraged, well, I assumed in my research, was the same. And indeed, if we look at those boring, repetitive, iterative, non-reflexive diaries, we actually see that they served as tools for navigating the social reality and the Soviet temporality that you tried to insert yourself into. So how do I manage my time? How do I navigate the Soviet calendar? How do I organize my life and prioritize certain things? It became this practice of effectively self-creation. So we don't think about it, this type of iterative writing as having to do anything with self-building, but actually both for Protestants and for Stalinist teenagers, however different they may be, it was about building their self and affirming their self again and again in this act of writing. And I will just give one brief example. I have a diarist who was born in a peasant family, and he went to school, but he also helped his parents with their agricultural activities, and he wanted to acquire an urban profession. Eventually, he had this idea to become a writer as well. So he wanted to benefit from Stalinist upward mobility and to escape his peasant surroundings. And when he started to write his diary, he didn't quite know how to write and what to do. He was trying different things. He was just getting used to actually opening his notebook and writing. And for about a year, he wrote about different things like weather and things done around the house and letters his family received and all those things. But also, without fail, he wrote, "I went to school today." And you would think like, okay, you go to school, this is kind of obvious, why would you write it every single day without any other details? Just, "I went to school," or "today I didn't go to school because this and this," or "because it was a holiday," or "because I had to help my father," or whatever. And when you look at it, you start thinking that it had some value, this kind of repetition of saying that he went to school as a sort of carving out this time that was his own. It wasn't his family time, it wasn't peasant time, it was his time that was adjacent to this urban Soviet time. And eventually his diary became very interesting, and he started writing about many different things. And you can actually see how this "I went to school" bloomed into this very intricate interim zone of private writing, where he navigated his life at the junction of those two temporalities of his family and his school life and his Komsomol work, and that he started associating himself with his academic persona, himself as a student, and he put a lot of emphasis on this, and it all came to fruition from this kind of iterative act of writing, "Oh, I went to school." And I find it fascinating. So yeah, my hot take is that we should read more boring diaries.
I imagine that you've got to know some of these diarists very well.
Very well.
Yeah. How do you feel about them now? Do you feel quite connected to them?
Oh yes, I do, absolutely. I sometimes call them my boys in my head, which is a bit creepy, but you know. Yeah, and I sympathize with them a lot, and I have my kind of favorite stories from different diaries and different quirky ways they express certain things, because not all of them were that very literate. Some of them came from poor peasant or worker families. I believe that this is very important to give space for them to talk about themselves and to tell their stories, because many of them didn't actually get to become adults because they died at the front during the Great Patriotic War, because they were 17, 18, 19, 20 when the war broke out. So of course they were conscripted, they were drafted, and they went fighting. So some of them survived and lived long lives, and became only one became a poet, the one I mentioned, but a couple of them became literary scholars.
Nice.
Yeah, so I do empathize a lot with them, and I think they have a lot to tell us and give us a lot of insight into what life was like when they were growing up.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to share that with me. It was absolutely fascinating.
Thank you. Thank you.